Face Downwards, from The Affair at Ysterspruit by Herman Bosman. When the talk came round to the old days, leading up to and including the Second Boer War, I was always interested when they had a photograph that I could examine at some farmhouse in that part of the Groot Marico district that faces towards the Kalahari. And when they showed me, hanging framed against a wall of the voorkamer, or having brought it from an adjoining room, a photograph of a burgher of the South African Republic, father or son or husband or lover, then it was always with a thrill of pride in my land and my people that I looked on a likeness of a hero of the Boer War. I was a school teacher many years ago at a little school in the Marico Bushveld, near the border of the Bechuanaland Protectorate. The Transvaal Education Department expected me to visit the parents of the school children in the area at intervals. But even if this huisbesoek were not part of my after-school duties, I would have gone and visited the parents in any case. And when I discovered, after one or two casual calls, that the older parents were fond of first-class story material, that they could hold the listener enthralled with tales of the past, with embroidered reminiscences of Transvaal life in the old days, then I became very conscientious about huisbesoek. What happened after that, Wim? I would say, calling on a parent for about the third week in succession. When you were tracking through the kloof that night, and you had muzzled both the black calf with the dappled belly and your daughter, so that Mojaja's men would not be able to hear anything. And then the Wim would knock out the ash from his pipe onto his velskoen, and he would proceed to relate. His words had a slow and steady rumble, with the red dust of the road in their sound almost. A tale of terror, or of high romance, or of soft laughter. It was quite by accident that I came across Oma Engelbrecht in a two-roomed, mud-walled dwelling, some little distance off the government road, and a few hundred yards away from the homestead of her son-in-law, Stoffel Brink, on whom I had called earlier in the afternoon. I had not been in the Marico very long then, and my interview with Stoffel Brink had been, on the whole, unsatisfactory. I wanted to know how deep the Boer trenches were dug into the foot of the koppies at Magersfontein, where Stoffel Brink had fought. Stoffel Brink, on the other hand, was anxious to learn whether, in regard to what I taught the children, I would follow the guidance of the local school committee, of which he was chairman, or whether I was one of that new kind of school teacher who went by a little printed book of subjects supplied by the education department. He added that this latter class of schoolmaster was causing a lot of unpleasantness in the Bushveld, through teaching the children that the earth moved round the sun, and through broaching similar questions of a political nature. I replied evasively, with the result that Stoffel Brink launched forth for almost an hour on the merits of the old-fashioned Hollander schoolmaster, who could teach the children all he knew himself in 18 months, because he taught them only facts. If a child stays at school longer than that, Stoffel Brink added, then the rest of the time he can only learn lies. I left about then, and on my way back a little distance from the road, and half concealed by a tall bush, I found the two-roomed dwelling of Oma Engelbrecht. I could see that Oma Engelbrecht did not have much time for her son-in-law, Stoffel Brunk. For when I mentioned his references to education, when I had merely sought to learn some details about the Boer trenches at Magersfontein, she said that maybe he could learn all there was to know in 18 months, but that he had not learned how to be ordinarily courteous to a stranger who came to his door. A stranger, moreover, who was a schoolmaster asking for information about the Boer War. Then she spoke about her son, Johannes, who didn't have to hide in a Magersfontein trench, but who was sitting straight up on his horse when all those bullets went through him at Ysterspruit, and who died of his wounds some time later. Johannes had always been such a well-behaved boy, Oma Engelbrecht told me, and he was gentle and kind-hearted. She told me many stories of his childhood and early youth. She spoke about a time when a span of red Afrikaner oxen got stuck with the wagon in the drift, and her husband and the labourers, with long whip and short sambok, could not move them. And then Johannes had come along, and he had spoken softly to the red Afrikaner oxen, and he had called on each of them by name, and the team had made one last mighty effort, and had pulled the wagon through to the other side. And yet they never understood him in these parts, Oma Engelbrecht continued. They say things about him, and I hardly ever talk of him anymore. And when I show them his portrait, they hardly even look at it, and they put the picture away from them. And when they are sitting on that rustbank, where you are sitting now, they place the portrait of Johannes face downwards beside them. I told Oma Engelbrecht, laughing reassuringly the while, that I stood above the pettiness of local intrigue. I told her that I had already noticed that there were all kinds of queer undercurrents below the placid surface of life in the Groot Marico. There was the example of what had happened that very afternoon, when her son-in-law, Stoffel Brunk, had conceived a nameless prejudice against me, simply because I was not prepared to teach the school children that the earth was flat. I told her that it was ridiculous to imagine that a man in my position, a man of education and wide tolerance, should allow himself to be influenced by local Dwarsberger gossip. Oma Engelbrecht spoke freely then, and the fight at Ysterspruit lived for me again. Kemp and Delaray and the captured English convoy, the ambush, and the booty of 1,000,000 rounds of ammunition. It was almost as though the affair at Ysterspruit was being related to me, not by a lonely old woman whose son received his death wounds on the vlaktes near Klerksdorp, but by a burger who had taken a prominent part in the battle. And so naturally I wanted to see the photograph of her son, Johannes Engelbrecht. When it came to the Boer War, although I did not say this to Oma Engelbrecht, I didn't care if a Boer commander was not very competent or very cunning in his strategy, or if a burger was not particularly brave. It was enough for me that they had fought. And to me, General Snyman, for instance, in spite of the history book's somewhat unflattering assessment of his military qualities, was a hero nonetheless. I'd seen General Snyman's photograph somewhere. That face was like Transvaal bloedklip. Those eyes had no fire in them, but a stubborn and elemental strength. You still see Boers in the backveld with that look today. It was well on towards evening when Oma Engelbrecht, yielding at last to my cajoleries and entreaties, got up slowly from her chair and went into the adjoining room. She returned with a photograph enclosed in a heavy black frame. I waited, tense with curiosity, to see the portrait of that son of hers who had died of wounds at Ysterspruit, and whose reputation the loose prattle of the neighborhood had invested with a dishonor as dark as the frame about his photograph. Flicking a few specks of dust from the portrait, Oma Engelbrecht handed the picture to me. And she was still talking about the things that went on in a mother's heart, things of pride and sorrow that the world did not understand, when in an unconscious reaction and hardly aware of what I was doing, I placed beside me on the rustbank, face downwards, the photograph of a young man whose hat brim was cocked on the right side jauntily, and whose jacket with narrow lapels was buttoned up high. With a queer jumble of inarticulate feelings, I realized that, in the affair at Ysterspruit, they were all Mauser bullets that had passed through the youthful body of Johannes Engelbrecht, National Scout.